Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's BizSmart webinar. Our weekly webinars are aimed to provide advice and share knowledge on key business topics and specialist areas. And joining me today is BizSmart Select Member and Core Advisor Ian Priest from Independent Bankers Consultant. Before we start our webinar, can I ask you to post any questions using your question mark function on your screen, and Ian will do his best to answer them all at the end of the session. Many thanks, and over to you, Ian.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Terms of trade are important. In fact, they're vital, particularly if you are exporting. Let's just give you an example. You're selling glasses, tumblers, and your top salesman is brilliant. So you decide you're going to have a go at exporting, and you send him off to Dubai, and within a couple of days he's met somebody and they place a huge order for your glasses. What he doesn't do is negotiate the terms of trade. You sell the glasses in the UK for £1, and he's agreed a deal for 100,000 glasses at the equivalent of £1. What he hasn't taken into account is the terms of trade. The buyer is expecting that goods delivered, and he's going to pay you in 6 months' time. Your salesman is used to selling them delivered in the UK and payment within normally a month. It can make a huge impact. So it's not just negotiating the sale, you have to make sure you negotiate the terms. If you're exporting particularly, be very, very clear about the terms. Whichever terms you agree will involve some risk, and that tends to be a sliding scale with either you taking all of the risk or the buyer taking all of the risk. Normally it ends up somewhere in between, but again, you need to understand where you are on that sliding scale. Payment up front. If you can get payment up front for your goods, that's the best place to be. All the risk then sits firmly with the buyer. I've got a client that exports product all around the world. People go onto their website, they pay for the goods, and they're shipped. Perfect for the exporter. The issue is all in the buyer's hands. If the goods aren't quite what they expected when they get there, it's their problem to deal with, not yours as the seller. The other end of the scale, on open account, you deal with a buyer in a foreign country the same way as you would do with a UK company. You send the goods, you send an invoice, and you expect to get paid. Sometimes, perhaps, possibly, maybe. Once your goods are overseas, it's very, very difficult to get them back. I had a client who was exporting hemp beer to the West Indies. They paid for the first container before it was shipped. They paid for the second container before it was shipped. They paid for the third container about 4 days after it was shipped, but a long time before it landed. The 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th containers all went on the water, and they didn't pay for any of them. And then he got 4 container loads of hemp beer that had cost him about £200,000, all sat on the dock in Jamaica. Nobody wanted to pay for them, and he was being charged local charges for storing them. And in the end, the port authorities auctioned them off for enough to cover their costs. I'll give you half a guess who bought them. So, how do you minimise the risk? You can do credit checks. UKTI, various credit agencies or credit insurers can help you do that. You can take out credit insurance, take out bad debt cover, or you can use the banking system and the document controls that can bring to the process. So how do you use the banking system for imports and exports? Banks essentially were set up to support international trade. Rather than lugging large amounts of cash and gold coin around the world, banks in different countries issued letters that could be cashed with a bank in another country. And they still have a vital role in that international trade piece. But excuse me, it's important that exporters understand banks have no interest in the goods. Their only interest is the documents, and the documents have to be right, and your instructions to the bank have to be right. There are two equal and opposite systems. There's documentary collections and there's documentary credits. And again, it's a risk continuum from high risk for the exporter, low for the importer, to low for the exporter and high for the importer. And again, you can sit in between. So you've done your credit checks, you're happy you want to go ahead and sell your goods to an importer in a foreign currency. You need to be very clear what terms are agreed, the payment date, are you offering credit terms or are you expecting payment on delivery? How have you priced? Is it cost, factory gate price? Is it cost, insurance and freight? Where are you supplying the goods to? Factory gate, that's literally your factory gate. The dock may be free alongside or actually loaded onto the ship, free on board or delivered. You know, different terms can have very different meanings and can have very different costs. Doesn't seem to be a difference between free alongside and free on board. Actually, there is a huge difference in the cost because once it's passed over the rail of the ship, you've got shipping documents, you've got insurance, a whole lot more comes into play than just actually a lorry arriving at the docks. You need to consider what documents the buyer will want. The list can vary from certificates of origin, sustainable resources, health insurance. There's a whole myriad of documents that the buyer might want. And finally, what payment method are you using? All of these need to be agreed with your buyer before you speak to the bank. Documentary collections, they can be very safe for the seller and a bit riskier for the buyer. As the seller, you get together your shipping documents, that's your bill of lading or your airway bill, and any other documents that the buyer has asked for, insurance, any certificates of origin, anything like that that needs to be drawn up. You draw up a bill of exchange. Effectively, you write a check that the buyer is going to sign, which can be a sight, which means it's payable as soon as it's presented, or payable at a future date. In other words, a promise to pay is like a post-dated check. You take all these documents to the bank and give them your instructions. The bank will then post the documents by airmail to a bank in the buyer's country. When they arrive there, the buyer is contacted by that bank and he goes in, and if it's a sight bill, he pays for the goods there and then. If it's a forward dated bill, he accepts it. In other words, he signs it, and the bank hand over the documents. And those documents, particularly the bill of lading, they are the documents of title to those goods. So once he's got those documents in his hand, he can go to the docks and collect his goods. The safety measure for you there is he has to go into the bank and either pay or sign that bill of exchange, which is his promise to pay, before they hand over the document that allow him to collect the goods. The risk for the seller, well, he may just decide he changed his mind and not turn up and pay, and you've shipped your goods and they're stuck, probably incurring costs, which is often called demurrage, in a foreign port. The buyer may not pay the bill on the due date, and you have to start legal action for payment in a foreign country. And you're reliant on an overseas bank, and although they are supposed to be governed by the uniform rules for collection, Not everybody does. For the buyer, the risks are that he's gone into the bank, he's paid for the goods, or he's signed a promise to pay, and then finds the goods aren't quite what he was expecting. They're substandard, or they've got damaged, and he's already paid for them. Documentary credits, the opposite way around. Very safe for the seller, more expensive and troublesome for the buyer. And as I said, they're almost exactly the other way around. Documentary credits are opened, in other words, they're set up by the buyer. The buyer tells his bank what he is buying, how much he's paying and on what dates, and what documents he needs to have to support the shipment. Again, bills of lading, certificates of origin, insurance, all the rest of it. The instruction can be to pay on production of the documents or at a fixed future date. His bank sends the instruction to your bank or to another local bank. You will be contacted and asked to bring in the documents. You take in all the documents that are required. The bank check the documents against the schedule and make payment according to the instruction. The bank then posts off the documents to the issuing bank so the buyer can collect his goods. So in other words, you get paid when you take the documents to the bank. For the seller, it's extremely safe. If the documents are in order, you get paid. If it's for a future payment, you might be able to get paid early by discounting that bill of exchange. In other words, if it's for £100,000, you might be able to sell that for £95,000, £96,000, £97,000 to somebody else. So you get your cash and then they'll collect the money on the due date. The buyer bears the costs of setting up the credit. The downside for the buyer is that buyer's bank will normally want cash to cover the value of the payment from day one, even if it's not payable for 90 or 120 days. Again, the buyer is taking a risk that the seller will actually ship the goods and take the documents to the bank. He's already committed a facility and is paying for it. And remember, the bank is only dealing in documents. The goods themselves may not be as expected. There we go.
Thank you very much.
Has anybody got any questions for me?
Great. Okay. Let's have a look. Yeah, we've got some questions coming through. The first one, I now realise my documentation is incorrect and I know that I will not get paid for my goods. What help is there out there for me?
Oh, that's a real stinker. It's like the Irishman asking for directions. You wouldn't start from there. To be honest, you are stuck with the local legal system. If you've got credit insurance, you can try them. Again, if your documentation's not right, they're not going to be overly keen, but it's on there. Otherwise, you really are stuck with dealing with the local legal system in the country where you've shipped the goods. To give you an example, I'm told India has an excellent court system for dealing with commercial disputes. Unfortunately, it takes about 15 years for a case to come up the list to get in front of the court. So yeah, good luck. You probably win your case in about 15 years time. It really comes back to make sure you get the documentation right in the first place, because it's very, very difficult to unpick afterwards. And trying to win a court case in a foreign country where you don't understand the language, you don't understand the local legal system and customs is very, very hard.
Thank you very much. Another question comes through. How can I protect myself against exchange rate movements?
Okay, that's something I didn't cover in this webinar and perhaps could have done, or we'll do that on a future one. Yeah, if you're selling in foreign currency, there can, particularly if there's a time delay between when you agree the contract and when you actually supply the goods and get paid, there can have been a huge shift in the exchange rate. For example, I was talking to a business just a couple of weeks ago that had a £200,000 contract to supply some goods. Unfortunately, in the time, it took about 12 months between when they agreed the contract and when the goods were supplied, and there'd been a 5% shift in the exchange rate in that time, which wiped out their entire profit on that deal. There's two things you can do. You can protect yourself against that exchange rate movement by locking in or getting an option on an exchange rate now. It's called a forward contract, and essentially you agree with a bank or another foreign currency house that they will supply you with the amount of currency, or they will buy from you the amount of currency on a specific date at an exchange rate that they fix now. And that way, it doesn't matter what happens in the real world, your exchange rate is fixed. There's a halfway house with that. You can take an option rather than a fix, in which case, if the exchange rate's moved in your favor, you can take the real world exchange rate, and if it hasn't, you can take your option. You'd normally have to pay for an option. With a fix, the cost is usually worked into the exchange rate that they are offering you. You don't have to go to the banks, whether you're doing forward contracts or just dealing with currency coming in and going out. Far from me to say the banks are rip-off merchants, but the banks are rip-off merchants. They have big overheads in their foreign departments, and that gets reflected in the interest rate, in the exchange rates that they offer. There are companies out there that can offer exchange rates that are 3, 4, 5% better than the banks. If you're dealing with £1,000 and an extra £50, that's nice. If it's £100,000 and it's an extra £5,000, that starts to get really interesting. The banks aren't necessarily the best for foreign currency, and if anybody is buying or selling in currencies, get in touch with me and I will help you find the best exchange rates.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Ian. I hope that answered those questions. If you do have any more questions, I will be sending out Ian's contact details to everybody on the webinar this afternoon, and also a copy of the presentation, so please do get in touch. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you make our webinars a regular slot in your calendar. And Ian and I wish you all have a great afternoon.